body of satellite photography that can tell you a whole lot. And then there's even more cutting edge technology like infrared photography that can measure carbon in soil. So we're a year or two away from having the technology at hand to where any farmer in the world who can type in or have someone type in for them the GPS coordinates of a piece of land, who describes the farming practices that they're using, who can obtain soil samples of the different landscapes that they're looking at, who we will be able to tell how much carbon above ground and below ground they're storing. And so if you have people who are willing to voluntarily pay $100 per ton of carbon sequestered, and it's verifiable, where they can go on the internet and they can literally see the acre of land that they're talking about. They can see a picture of the farmer or the community that's doing it. They can see a description of the farming practices being used, and they trust the organization, in our case it'd be Regeneration International, that has either paid a site visit to the farm or is verifying it in a way. This will help. This is not the solution, but I just wanted to go over how carbon sequestration is measured. And from the standpoint of Regeneration International and justice, we must have a system in place that is not only accurate, but that doesn't cost the farmer anything to measure it. And once we have that, we will be able to get the voluntary contribution, and then we're going to have to force the people with carbon footprints who refuse to deal with that, the companies, to do it. So another question was on the cost of organic food. Obviously, more people in the pandemic are now understanding the importance of home-cooked, healthy food. In the United States, for example, sales of organic produce have grown 20% since the first of the year. So this is a good thing, that there's a greater demand for organic food. The problem is, if people can't afford organic food, they're not going to be able to buy it. They have to have access to it. They have to be able to afford it. And this is why, if we're serious about solving the climate crisis, about solving mediating some of the damage of this pandemic, solving the other problems we have, we got to put more money in the pockets of people who can't afford healthy food. In the United States, we got 20 million people working in the food chain, all the way from farm workers to farmers, of course, to grocery store clerks, to people who drive trucks, people who stack food on shelves, and so on. 40% of America's food chain workers cannot afford organic food. This is an outrage, and this is not possible. If we want people to buy healthy food and improve their health, and improve the environment at the same time, we can't separate economic justice from food justice, from health justice, from climate justice. I think we all understand this. And ideas that seemed crazy a few years ago, like a guaranteed income for everyone, if we look around the world, there's countries right now that are doing this, like Denmark, like Norway, that as long as the pandemic lasts, they're paying people a subsistence to stay healthy, to not infect other people, to get prepared for when we can have a greener economy. So that's trying to answer that. Someone asked, when I talked about how we have to get 20% buy-in from farmers for regenerative best practices in order to sequester enough carbon to hit carbon neutrality by 2030. Was I talking about 20% of America's 2 million farms? Or was I talking about 20% of the farmland? No, I meant 20% of the farmland. I mean, it roughly corresponds to 20% of ranchers and farmers. But this is quite possible. In the United States, we have 1.9 billion acres of farmland, ranch land, forest land, parkland, urban land. We only need to transform about 20% of this over the next 10 years to best practices in order to hit our goals. Of course, our ultimate goal is all these 1.9 billion acres of land will be transformed. And just think of we got 175 million acres in the United States of public rangelands. This is almost 10% of all of our farmland and rangeland. If we had enlightened public policy that would subsidize ranchers using this public rangeland properly, instead of making them pay right now and having them carry out practices that are degrading it further, we'd be a long ways around that. But the bulk of farmland in America does not grow food for humans, especially vegetables and fruits. The bulk of our farmland is and rangeland is to graze animals before they go to the feedlot or the factory farm, you know, and to provide the grain to feed them in the factory farm. If we don't change this, we're not going to be able to reach our goals. We can either have factory farming and vast expanses of GMO soybeans and corn, vast expanses of industrial wheat, canola, other crops, cotton, or we can have a stable climate and an environment that's restored. We can't have both. And one interesting development in this whole pandemic is the expose of factory farms as breeding grounds for disease, as inhumane places to work for the workers who are in those, and as literally death camps for things like these pandemics. So hopefully we'll get away from that. A couple more questions that were answered. What about a civilian regeneration corps, sort of like the civilian conservation corps that we had during the New Deal that employed 4 million people?
Yes.
To restore environments and, you know, I mean, do socially beneficial work like arts programs, education. Indeed, we need that. Some of the programs of the more enlightened people in the Congress for what a Green New Deal would look like really emphasize this. We're going to have this. I guarantee you, if we can offer jobs at a decent wage to rebuild the environment, we're especially going to have a lot of young people who are going to be very happy to do this. How do we get this information into peer-reviewed journals? It's not that easy, but we have to keep trying. David Johnson, the guy I mentioned before, who's developed the revolutionary type of compost making that doubles production above ground and doubles carbon sequestration below ground. David has submitted his data, which is very good, to several peer-reviewed journals, and he got the answer back. Oh yeah, I read the summary. It was too good to be true. I didn't read the study. You know, this is what we're up against, and you know, we got to just keep on. But we got to understand that some of these practices, like holistic management and grazing and ecosystem restoration and multi-species grasses in pastures, multi-species grazing of animals, there's too many variables in this system to fit into the cookie counter approach of you got to do the same thing exactly the same way for 5 years so that I can get it into a peer-reviewed journal. That's very difficult. It doesn't mean it's not important, but it's very difficult. And ranchers and people out there on the land know that every ecosystem's different, every year is different, and you've got to be flexible. So, but we got to keep on. It's very important that we have the credibility for what we're doing. The carbon sequestration numbers, I think I already answered that. We are looking at, in the United States, half the work in reducing CO2 emissions is going to have to come through alternative energy and energy conservation. We all understand that. The other half, though, it's not just farming and ranching practices. It's also ecosystem restoration, which includes reforestation. There's a very important program of the United Nations called the Trillion Tree Campaign. This project was started by young people in Austria and Europe who said, what could we actually do on a global scale to reforest? Because the bottom line is that once on the earth, before we destroyed much of nature's bounty, we used to have 6 trillion trees, okay? At the point at which we had 6 trillion trees on the earth, we had that balance between the carbon in the atmosphere and the carbon in plants and trees and soils, and the CO2 in the ocean. We don't have that balance anymore. And part of how we're going to get to that balance is proper reforestation, regenerative reforestation, and taking better care of the forests that we've got now, and incorporating trees like they used to be in agriculture before someone got the idea of, oh, let's whack down all the trees so that we have the bigger expanse so we can use the bigger tractors and we can farm fence post to fence post and so on. So that's why when we talk about regeneration, it's tempting to just use the term regenerative agriculture. And that's fine that we use that terminology at times. But ever so often we should say regenerative food, farming, and land use, or regenerative food, farming, and ecosystem restoration. And obviously moving forward, we can't have the forest preservation movement over here, and the wildlife protectors over here, and the climate movement over here, and the organic movement over here, and the natural health movement over here, and the economic justice movement over here. It's like, as long as we keep working in these silos in isolation from one another, we're not going to educate the public to connect the dots. Take the pandemic right now. I'd say more people have thought about preserving the remaining wildlife habitat that we have on the earth. More people have thought about this in the last month than have thought about this in the last 20 years. I mean, we have no choice. There's 300 more emerging diseases that have been identified by scientists. These are viruses and bacteria that exist in animals and in habitat right now. And if we keep whacking away their habitat and stressing them out, like with the bats, they discard these viruses that don't hurt them. That's the reason they're the host for the virus. But if you whack down the forest where a bat is, can you imagine what that must feel like, right? And then the bat sees, oh yeah, there's this palm oil plantation that Unilever has set up down the road. Oh, look at all that food. I'm going to move from the jungle to the palm oil plantation, where there's people working, where there's closer contact between bats and humans than we've ever had before. The bush meat. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who have no choice but to hunt for monkeys, to hunt for these animals that are, civets or the pangolins or these other animals. It's just like, they're just trying to survive, but we have to educate people in these communities about the dangers of this, you know, and we've got to provide a regenerative opportunity for them to eat, you know, and the same thing goes for the wet markets. It's obviously a danger to have live animals, you know, together, crowded in conditions with food, animals that have already been slaughtered and so on and so forth. I mean, the reason people do this, if you don't have a refrigerator, what the hell are you going to do? You know, if you don't have a truck to get your the animal that you're selling to the market, what are you going to do? So obviously, if we don't start seriously looking at the roots of rural poverty around the world and dealing with it, and if we don't incentivize the people who live adjacent to wildlife habitat to take care of this, we're going to continue having these problems. Now, we got another problem too, is that we've got these laboratories all over the world that are trying to weaponize these viruses and bacteria. They say, oh, it's for defensive reasons. In the United States, we study viruses and bacteria in places like Fort Detrick, Maryland, because we say, oh, in case the Chinese attack us, you know, with a virus, we got to know how to defend ourselves. And so we got to know how to produce an Ebola, of a species of Ebola or a species of SARS or a species of coronavirus that is so powerful, be like the atomic bomb. No one's going to attack the United States because we're going to attack them back with chemical and biological warfare and annihilate them. Well, you know, in a way, this sounds reasonable. It's sort of like atomic bombs. You know, it's like, how come no one attacks the U.S. with atomic bombs? Well, it's because we would annihilate them. And so it's called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. People kind of understand this, and that's why there's a global understanding that we need to get rid of all nuclear weapons, you know, period. That's just sanity. That's not, you know, but what people don't understand is that this new generation of chemical and biological warfare weapons, you know, is a very similar situation. Now, up until now, it does not look like this was a genetically engineered virus that was deliberately released from a chemical and biological warfare lab. That is not what anyone is saying, you know, that I have read, you know. But what did happen, it appears, and there was finally a story in the Washington Post on April 14th, is that it looks like this was an accidental leak of a coronavirus being studied in a lab right next to the Wuhan seafood market. Scientists pointed this out right away in China. I mean, there were articles on the internet, there were newspaper stories, you know, and the Chinese government disappeared that information, and they also disappeared the scientists. Okay, so you look at, well, how come we're not talking about this? The Washington Post pointed out that the U.S. Embassy in Beijing visited those chemical and biological warfare labs in Wuhan numerous times in January of 2018. And they were in a panic after what they saw. They sent back cables, the State Department, back to the Trump administration saying, oh my God, you can't believe what's going on in those labs. You know, they don't have the proper staffing, the proper training. They're not using the proper equipment. They said straight out, it's in the article I'm writing for next week's Organic Bite. They said straight out, there's a danger of releasing a SARS type epidemic on the world. Okay. Well, what did the Trump administration do? Nothing about this. But it goes deeper than this. We were funding that work in the lab. The National Institutes of Health had a grant for $3.7 million into the Wuhan Virology Lab to study coronaviruses and bat coronaviruses, not just coronaviruses, and
Ronnie, Ronnie,
yes,
Ronnie.
yes.
Yeah, I might agree with much of what you're saying right now, but I think, and it's all very interesting, and I read about this stuff too, and find it of importance. But I think you've strayed from. I think you're straying from the
All
conference.
right. Well,
Sorry.
I'm just trying to make the point that regenerative agriculture and food farming and land use uh, in an environment ravaged the way we've got it now is very difficult. So I'm sorry about that. I got off from the wildlife preservation, which is not just some obscure issue, the wet markets, which are not some obscure issue, the dependence of global campesinos on bushmeat, these are not secondary issues that we can ignore. We have to ignore them, and we better start dealing with them right now. And I think those were the long-term
But
drought.
I think
Someone asked about
thing, Ronnie, there's another thing that you are saying, which is there's a divergence between local decentralized actions like what you're doing and a number of other people are, and some of the central power actions. And having some kind of foothold on projects like regenerative agriculture and soil carbon sequestration in a context like that is a very big challenge. And how do you engage the diverse local efforts in a way that they move with you and become sort of cohesed into a wave of blessed unrest that we're talking about here?
Well, yeah, I think we all have to understand every one of us lives in one of the 1 million communities in the world, and this is where our primary work needs to be. This is why I'm engaged in farming in north central Mexico and farming in northern Minnesota when I'm there. But what is important is that there are practices in our local areas, whether it's food farming, ecosystem restoration, innovative ways to rebuild local systems, innovative ways to educate youth and the public. If we will do a thorough search in our areas for the best practices, this is amazingly important, because what we will find is that most people have never heard of the best practices in our local areas, and they need to hear about them in adjoining areas, in the region, at the national level, at the international level. Someone like David Johnson, his revolutionary compost system. I mean, this started in his backyard in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and people looked at him like, are you nuts? You're collecting all the leaves from the city's, solid waste thing and whatever. David kept going on, and he kept studying, and he brought himself to the attention, his work, of New Mexico State University and some other research firms, and they saw the value of his work. But if he had not started with his backyard, because that was the only place he had the resources to start with, and if he hadn't persevered through the scientific experimentation and the demonstration on a small scale, and then at the level of a larger scale with peppers and with cotton plants and so on, he would not have gotten, Scientific American talking about this last September, or a year ago September. And same thing, like I think I mentioned today, some farmers about an hour and a half from here in Mexico discovered something on their farm out of desperation that no one had ever figured out in the whole world, which is that if you take the major part of the agave plant and chop it up finely in a machine that they designed and ferment it in a closed container for 30 days, you end up with high quality animal feed, the cheapest in the world. No one ever developed this before, And when you look at the fact that 40% of the world's landscapes are getting more and more drought ridden. Someone asked a question about what do you do about long-term drought in the Southwest? Well, I mean, it's not just the Southwest. 40% of the world's farmlands are getting drier and harder to farm and impossible to farm and then turning into desert. Here's a solution that I didn't discover this, this agave mesquite silvopasture system that has tremendous ability to grow food for animals, restore environment. One of them came to one of our workshops on organic compost, one of these farmers, and he said, Ronnie, have you ever heard about fermenting agave and mesquite to make animal feed? I said, no. He said, well, we've been doing this for 7 years. We're the only farm that we've ever seen doing it. We can't find anything on the internet about this, but we're doing it. Would y'all like to come out next week and see it? And so we did. And so I'm just saying that people are doing amazing, amazing things all over. And that's the value of our local work, and it's also, people listen to you a lot more. If you can talk about, what you are doing practically, as well as what you've read and what you've synthesized together. And politicians, regeneration is not a partisan issue. I mean, what we encourage people to do in the United States and all over the place, like Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal, which is a coalition that we helped start. We have 20,000 farms and ranches now. And what we're telling people is one of the most important things you can do is invite politicians, once the pandemic is over now, invite politicians out to your farm, so they can see what you're doing. Because, seeing is believing, and, have them eat lunch while they're out there. Have a good social gathering. And by the way, don't just invite politicians. A lot of the young climate activists are vegans for good reason, because they hate factory farming. But they've never been to a ranch and understood that, hey, if you're a climate activist, and you want to solve this problem, a major solution to this problem is treating animals humanely, but in a management system that builds soil, that doesn't destroy, and that produces, if you're going to eat meat and animal product, much healthier product. So I really believe local is where it's at. But what the mistake we've made in the last 50 years since the first Earth Day that I participated in was that we stopped with our local work. We didn't understand that if you find something good locally that needs to be emulated, you got to help promote this on a bigger scale. It's our obligation as local organizers to get the best of the best and share that. And, our farm in northern Minnesota and our farm in north central Mexico, one of the things I'm most proud about is to see these school buses pull up. Again, we've had to stop this because of the pandemic. But when you see a school bus pull up, or several or 3 or 4 school buses, and you got 150 kids get off the bus, and some of them, sometimes we have the chiquitos, we have the little first graders and second graders. They get off the bus, they're coming to see an organic farm, they're coming to see permaculture methods, they're coming to see beautiful farm animals and beautiful vegetable beds, and how you capture water, and how you build buildings out of natural adobe, and how you can run a big farm and feed lots of people with no well, with rainfall capture and that. This changes their life. These kids will say, oh, I didn't know farms were like this, And the older ones, the teenagers, will say, well, I had already made up my mind. I'm leaving the village. As soon as I'm 16, I'm leaving. And they used to say, and I'm going to Texas because I can make $10 an hour in Houston, or whatever. No, once young people see the beauty of nature, the beauty of animals, the possibility that you can have an economic livelihood, this is a big deal. And so you don't have to have a fancy farm, you can bring young people out into nature and so on. It's not just young people either. So um, further, let's see, I should look at the chat. All right. Howard Bernstein saying, I cannot conceive of returning to global environmental balance with our current level of human population, even at reduced rates of growth. But our overpopulation is very difficult to address and seldom is. Well, I mean, I think what I've seen in my experience, and I've spent about half my life in the global south, Mexico and points south of here, is that the problem, a major problem of family planning is lack of education, interference of the Catholic Church, for example, which is the church I was raised in, that's still talking crazy stuff about family planning. But also it has to do with poverty. When you're in areas like India, where they have extreme poverty, I mean, rural India makes Mexico look totally prosperous, In rural India, it's literally a question of, you ask families, well, how come you have 6 kids or 8 kids? And well, an earlier kid died. There's so much child death. 5 million children die every year of hunger. 5 million. Okay. If your culture is part of it where you see young people dying, you are going to have more kids. And also you're going to have more kids because when you get old and you can't work, if your society is not going to take care of you, you want kids that do. All right, but the bottom line to me, it's just like Hawken says in his book Drawdown, education of young women, especially in the global south, and economic empowerment of women to be able to, have money, to be able to have land, and so on. You see, over the last 50 years, every time the population you address this issue by poverty reduction, increased education, with a focus on young women, you see a sharp drop off in the birth rate, and it's like the women. We have 35 workers on our farm in Mexico here. Most of them are young women. And what they tell me is like, since I started working here, I mean, we've been doing this 10 years. Once I developed confidence in my farming abilities, once I developed confidence in my leadership that I can actually tell these macho guys on the crew what to do and stand up to them, it made me feel different back at home. They said, the girls all say this. They say, oh, the boys in the community, all they want to do is get you into bed, have sex. Once you're pregnant, they leave. They go to Texas or they go here or there, or whatever. It's like, I am not going to let that happen, anymore. It's like, this is a question of the machismo in these cultures, but it's also a question of women are the real leaders. Women are most of the farmers in the world. They do most of the farm work in the world. They do most of the housework in the world. They do most of the cooking in the world. They think more about the health of the community. It's like, and that is the solution. It's like, I'm not against birth control. I'm not against family planning, but I do believe that if we don't deal with global poverty, and especially the super exploitation of poor and rural women and indigenous women, it's going to be very hard to get around this. But I've seen it in Mexico. I first started coming here in the mid 60s. I've seen the birth rate fall by 60% across the country. And the places where people still have way too many kids are the areas where women are still discriminated against the most and where the people are the poorest. And
Do you do any literacy teaching for the women who are working for you? Is there
well,
any?
Mexico has, because of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, 1920, there is a pretty darn good system of, at least you learn how to read, you learn how to write. Uh, what our, and some of our workers are graduates of agronomy schools. We have our workforce, or several of them are graduates of agronomy schools, but they were, from middle class or lower middle class backgrounds before that. And then kids who just grew up in the valley from on impoverished farms. And what they're interested in doing is learning English. And so, yes, we do programs to teach English. And the reason they want to learn English is because part of the future of organic and regenerative farming in Mexico, you do need to tap into ecotourism as well in order to get enough money to sustain this. And also,
Right.
so much of the and so much of the good information, we don't realize this if we're an English speaker. So much of the good information about regeneration is only in English, and that's why we have 5 people who do nothing but social media in English and Spanish. Everything we do, we're translating into Spanish. But then we see, like, we're working with incredible people in Regeneration International in Brazil, who are taking deforested Amazon land and producing regenerative farms out of it, and very quickly, in 4 or 5 years, restoring that land in an amazing way. But they speak Portuguese, and almost no one speaks Portuguese. And so they're over in that corner, and so on and so forth. And one of the things we do with the money we raise is we pay a global translation service to translate some key articles into other languages, including Russian and Chinese and French and German and Spanish and Portuguese and so on. And that's very important. But there's also amazing software now that does a better job than Google Translate used to do. And so it's not that hard to select, copy and paste something you write in English, and then you open this program that translates it into Spanish. You've got a pretty darn good translation. And then we just have our native speakers. I'm bilingual, but I'm by no means, at a college level of translating for Spanish. But, we can do it. And the main thing, though, I was so impressed by that, the Janot's workshop on Haiti. The key to all this is just opening up our hearts. The Haitian people, again, you go to Haiti, it makes rural Mexico look prosperous. Those people have been hammered from every direction, for 2 centuries, and the fact that the young people there are bouncing back in the way they are. We got to open our hearts to the beauty of the people of the world. Most of them are like our kids, or younger than our kids, or our grandkids' age. This is the majority of people in the world are our grandkids' age, And it's like, these people are so incredibly wonderful, if they're given a chance, but they're scared to death right now, It's just like, we can come together, and I think it's going to be regeneration. It's spiritual regeneration, like Pope Francis has pointed out, as much as this is improving our agricultural skills. So anyway, Howard, that was a long way to go around that. Adam says, talk about planting forests, not trees. I agree that. I agree. We have, for example, in this community, this is a high desert area where we are. Like our county here, which I'm working on, we have 180,000 people. Most of them are right or near the poverty line. And we only get 20 inches of rain a year, and we only get it in, in the months of July, August, September, October. For 8 months, it doesn't rain. And the sun is strong, and all the land is overgrazed, in the rural areas of our county. And people don't know what to do about it. So when we talk about biodiversity and reforestation, but 90% of farmers and rural people, they don't have wells. They don't have wells, and they're never going to have a well. And the wells that we do have are being super exploited by agro-export companies to produce winter vegetables for the United States. So these people are never going to get wells. It's extremely difficult to reforest if you can't irrigate the seedlings, at least the first year, the dry season. And so that's why we've turned to native species. What are already growing here in profusion? And we have these shrubby looking trees with really big thorns that if you hit one of those, or if your animal hits one of those, you got a major problem. Mesquite or Versace, or the agave. You bump into one of those thorns, you are going to be wishing you hadn't. But as it turns out, if you look at the indigenous wisdom about these plants, there's a long tradition of using these desert plants that don't need irrigation for many, many purposes. And so that's what we have hit on is we're going to plant 25 million agave plants over the next 10 years in this county. And not we, the villagers are going to plant them, and they're going to get paid a decent wage to do that because these small farmers discovered these native plants have incredible value as food. The mesquite pods for humans, the first thing indigenous people ate in this part of the world and in the southwestern US before they had corn 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, they were already eating mesquite flour, using it to bake and so on. They knew that these bean trees that start to flower right before the beginning of the rainy season, well, they had picked them off the tree and they tasted them and they're good. They taste good. So that was their food stuff. But we forgot that tradition. I guess you can find mesquite flour in a natural food store in most parts of the US. But we forgot that wisdom, that ancient wisdom. These things have 19% protein, the pods, it's just like, this is incredible. It's low glycemic, it's very important. All right. And the agave, well, people think, oh yeah, that's just a funny giant plant that you can produce pulque or mezcal or tequila from, but it's not good for anything else. Well, we forget indigenous people made all their textiles out of this, their writing instruments out of this, their rope, their bags. There was a boom 200 years ago of the Henneken industry because it was used for a lot of things. We forgot that these alcoholic beverages, or they're not even any alcohol before they're fermented, are very nutritious. We're now discovering that, if you dry out the liquid in the agave, in the pina part, you can make a thing called inulin or inulina. It's very important to diabetics. It helps diabetics mitigate the problems and so on. And then these farmers figured out, well, animals can't digest these massive leaves that come off the agave plant. Some of them weigh 40 to 80 pounds, one leaf, all right? Animals, if you chop them up, try to feed them to them, they're not interested. Well, they're not interested because there's there's compounds in them, saponins and lectins, that are indigestible. And so, people for a long time have treated the leaves of the agave that you prune as just garbage. You let them dry, maybe you can use them for barbecue for the wood. But these farmers, in their genius, figured out, yeah, but if you chop them up really finely, if you ferment them in closed containers for 30 days, the magic of fermentation is that it transforms these chemicals that were indigestible. Saponin is good for making soap, but it's not good for eating for animals or human, or the lectins, which can actually kill you if you ingest too much of them, turn into carbohydrates and sugar. And so, lo and behold, the poorest of the poor, none of these people have ever gotten a peer-reviewed journal. They figured this out. And now we're gonna take it to the next level, which is like, and everyone needs to do this. I'm serious about this. Your county where you live, there's 3,260 counties in the United States. We need a regeneration plan for every county in the US, And what does that mean? It means you look at what you have in terms of, your energy usage, your emissions now, and what they're going to be in 10 years if you make the kind of changes that everyone wants to see. But then you're going to end up with, okay, that takes care of about half the problem. Pretty much any county you live in, you can't take care of more than half the problem over the next 10 years through just alternative energy and energy conservation alone. The other half of the problem, which we can solve, is how do you turn a degenerated landscape into a regenerated landscape? And we literally have to look at this, we have to look at our urban areas, our suburban areas, our rural areas in our counties, and come up with a plan that can inspire us, and that can inspire others. Before I had to end my book tour about 6 weeks ago when the pandemic hit, what I do is every place I was going to speak, like Jefferson County, Iowa, right? I did a little homework before I got there. I looked at how much land is there in this county? How much of it is urban? How much of it is rural? What's the average emissions for a county in Iowa, and so on and so forth? And I came up with, in a matter of hours, you can come up with a rough draft plan for discussion that really inspires people, because people think that the solution to the climate, the solution to our low grade in terms of nutrition, food, the solution to our biodiversity loss and water quality and air quality, people tend to think that, well, other people are solving this. No, we all have to solve this, And once we have a plan in place, what we find out is that, well, I don't really know that much about the development of alternative energy in my county. Who can I talk to that knows this? I don't know that much about mass transportation in urban areas in my county right now, and how can we convert over to electric buses and so on. They're maybe free for people. There's people you can find out about that. And the farmers and ranchers, you find the best practitioners in your area, and you start to think creatively about, hey, this person is doing grass-fed beef in my county because I've met them at the farmer's market, or I've seen their picture up on the wall at my food co-op. I'm going to call them up and see if I can go out and see what they're doing, and it's happening. Someone asked a question about how are Gabe Brown and these other quote celebrity regenerative farmers and ranchers, how well are they doing educating other farmers? I mean, all I can tell you is that the farm days I've gone to in the last 2 years in the Midwest, which is definitely the heartland of degenerative farming, is, lots of people are turning out to these workshops that Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta and others are giving. And that these are farmers who have, in some cases, never heard. I mean, they've heard about cover cropping or they've heard about no-till. They have never heard the presentation, you know. And one thing I like about Gabe Brown is he comes from a religious background, Gabe. Uh, and so he puts regenerative food and farming and land use into the religious framework of taking care of creation, right? And this is really affected to people. Half the people in the audience is like the last workshop I went to in Redwood Falls, Minnesota. Um, a lot of the people are churchgoers who are there. And so you need the farmers speaking to other farmers. You need the Christians or the Muslims speaking to other Christians and Muslims, you know. And in the urban areas where there is red hot consciousness about injustice, you know, and sexism and gender discrimination, we need we need the young people especially to be the ones making these presentations. And so I think we're making progress, but how come the whole USDA extension service, you know, isn't people like Gabe Brown and Will Harris and Ray Archuleta or Elaine Ingham, you know, or Elizabeth Kaiser, you know, or some of these other farm leaders that we have. And so I hope that we can elect someone to the White House and have a balance of power in the House and Senate where these people will be open-minded to what we have to say. Because we've got a tremendous infrastructure in our agricultural schools, in our extension services, in our county soil conservation districts. You know, if we just had educated people in those positions, it'd be different. Or, you know, a lot of them tell me, like Ray Archuleta told me, I left the the NRDC, in National, what the hell is it? The Conservation Service of the USDA, the National, I guess it is National Natural Resources Development. Anyway, he worked there for 30 years.
Natural Resources
Conservation District.
Conservation.
Excuse me. I get Spanish words hooked up in my brain. But Ray told me, you know, I worked there for 30 years. That's the only branch of the government that really gets it about regenerative soil building and so on. And he said, but you know what? After 30 years, I just got tired of having to work twice as hard. So I left, and he joined forces with Gabe Brown and a bunch of other regenerative farmers to continue educating farmers and continue providing technical assistance, but outside the restrictive confines of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And one of the things I try to tell farmers, because I've been involved in fighting for organic standards and trying to stop organic standards from being degraded over time. I'm really sick of it. I'm really tired of fighting rear guard battles where a victory is making it a little bit less terrible, you know, the changes. And so what we've been talking about in Farmers and Ranchers for a Green New Deal is like, hey, let's raise our expectations. Who would you like to be Secretary of Agriculture in the next administration? You know, because if we get one of us in there, and we had one of us in there about 70 years ago, Henry Wallace, you know, under FDR. But if we got one of us in there, a family farmer who, you know, farmed organically and regeneratively, or a rancher who knew holistic management and ecological restoration, we wouldn't have to fight all these tiny battles. I mean, USDA has 100,000 employees, you know. It's like, let's raise our sights. And this goes for everything. Department of Energy, you know, natural resources. Let's not wait until Biden gets in there. I suspect Biden will be the next president, but let's not just wake up one day and see, oh my God, he appointed a corporate agribusiness person to be head of the USDA. You know, because that's what Obama did. You know, that's what Clinton did. That's what Reagan did. That's what both the Bushes did. You know, that's what Truman did. You know, it's like, hey, isn't it about time that we have a regenerator, you know, in place? And I think it is the time. And it's pretty exciting that we're reaching that point. Let's see. Question about or comment about from Hilder at Soul Center. Home compost is essential business in my community. Everyone should compost, grow their own veggies, or even a windowsill works for mini veg farming. I'd love to hear your thoughts about large scale abiotic efforts for carbon capture. I support tropical reforestation. I'm not sure I know what large scale abiotic efforts are. What is that?
I'm wondering, you mentioned before, so we try to capture carbon with vegetation and in the soil, but there are some industrial high-tech methods now being developed to capture carbon from the atmosphere. And I don't know what to think of that, so I'm just curious.
Well, I always read those stories because I'm so desperate for any solution. I don't care if some Silicon Valley inventor, you know, gets credit for doing something great. I'm all for it. But what I've read so far is that those systems for sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere are expensive. They're dangerous in terms of the long-term storage of this, and they don't work. And so what I always say is Mother Nature already has an incredible machine for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and turning it into living matter, and that's called photosynthesis. And so let's use the natural machinery and the natural techniques that we know work. And I'm definitely not against some funding for research because we are in dire straits, you know.
Yes.
And we have to look at everything. But at this point, I don't think I've seen anything that is that exciting and affordable. And that would, you know, the problem is that half the people in the world live in rural villages, and we need a solution that solves a bunch of problems at the same time. And basically, rural poverty and the climate crisis, we're only going to solve either one of those by a synergistic, you know, regenerative approach. So
I have one concern that's really weighing on me now. Here I'm living in suburban America on Long Island, in New York, and raising my children in the public school system. And it really troubles me that in the core curriculum, there is not proper education for them to understand resilience or climate resilience or sustainability. When they eat in the school cafeteria, they receive an apple that's wrapped in plastic. And most of the kids will just take it and dump it right into, so in our school, we're trying to change just very basic, giving the right instruction to the children in terms of appreciating food and food waste management. So we're starting a compost and obviously stopping this practice, but this seems like very foundational. In order to elect the right president, we must teach our children at the very core curriculum step to have that sustainable thought. And so I wonder how we can help shift this with just basic education. Um,
I think that's extremely important. The first 6 books that I ever wrote were children's books. And those
mhm,
were some of the most successful books I ever wrote because they went into schools and libraries and were read over and over and over again. And one thing I realized that it's extremely it takes extremely skillful people to be able to communicate to our little people, and we should realize that teachers and concerned parents are really on the front lines of regeneration, and mothers especially. Because we got to educate, we got to change these school systems. It's like an apple. Apple's a perfect example. I remember the Minneapolis school system, uh, they buy 60,000 apples a week for their, this was a number of years ago, for their program. But they're all chemical apples. They're all industrial agriculture apples. And so we went to the school board and we said, look, um, you are feeding the most toxic, fruit in America, as one of your major fruits in the school lunch program. And none of these apples, by the way, come from the Midwest or Minnesota, even though 50 years ago, all the apples in the Midwest came from, this 100-mile radius or your area. And we showed them the lab reports for the government statistics on the multiple pesticides that are in apples. We showed them the information about how young people are more vulnerable to toxins in the food because they don't weigh as much and they're growing faster and all this. Then we said, what if we can make you an offer for organic apples, that are approximately the same cost, as these chemical apples that you're feeding people. And they said, oh, well, work up a bid. And, as we got into this process, we contacted all these organic apple growers. Unfortunately, most of them are out west, because there's not enough organic apples being produced now in the Midwest to supply our school systems, even though a lot of farmers would like to grow more. And so anyway, we came up with a bid where basically the organic farmers would agree to make no money off the apples. They would give them at cost to the school district just so we could prove that children will eat healthier apples if you tell them about them, if they taste good, and so on. And so we didn't understand that we were tangling with corporate agribusiness special interests. The word got out about this, and so we came in with our bid for a year to supply the Minneapolis School District for 1 year through a local organic wholesale thing that would bring them from the state of Washington and Oregon. And it was 1 1/2 cents more expensive per apple than the chemical poison apples that they were getting. But we gave them a bid for a whole year, and so they came back to us and they said, no, your bid was 1 1/2 cents higher than what our normal distributor gave. But when we looked at the bid, the normal distributor gave them a 2-week bid that was 1.5 pennies cheaper. And so it just made us realize it's like people are deliberately poisoning our kids for profit. And the bureaucrats who run our systems are aiding and abetting this. Now, they don't think of it this way of picture a child eating an apple with 12 different pesticide residues on it. They don't think of it that way, but the institutional powers are there. And what they told us was like, look, we got a law, and this law exists across the United States. Basically, every school district nearly is hampered by this, which says that you can only buy food for the school lunch program, if it is as cheap or cheaper than any other bid. So I mean, what is this? You know, what are we dealing with? And then when you look at hospitals, at nursing homes, I mean, why are so many people dying of this coronavirus? Why you read in the paper? Well, 75% have pre-existing conditions, you know, and it's just like, and they're older, so on, or they're poor
It's
and
called
older and have pre-existing conditions.
apple toxicosis.
That's right. It's like pre-existing conditions are not an act of God. They're not something inevitable. You know, it's like, how come healthy people with healthy immune systems who eat organic food, who have a positive outlook on life, who are able to get exercise and fresh air, how come their bodies can fight off, in most cases, the coronavirus? And so we need to start thinking about this. And this is, you know, I'm considered a real radical because I don't mince words. But I think feeding our kids toxic apples and toxic food in schools is, you know, it's criminal negligence. And, you know, if someone did that, if someone slipped some poison in your food in a restaurant because they wanted to kill you, you know, and collect your life insurance or whatever, they would be subject to criminal. But how come we let the big food manufacturers, big ag and big food, do this to our kids to the point where, you know, our kids, 40% of the kids in America have chronic diseases now. When I was growing up, that figure was way, 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 way lower. Now, why is this the case? You know, I think we all know the answer.
So I have a thought about that coming from regenerative beef. And the first time I heard about this, I thought I'd try some organic grass-fed hamburger, and I got out the ketchup and the mustard and the onions and all that stuff, and I took one taste of that meat, and I put all the garnishings away because the meat had such flavor, and people have no idea in this country what real meat tastes like, and so somehow, and I don't quite know how, a campaign that said, you know, this apple looks like an apple, but this is not an apple. This apple is an apple, and here's why. Just taste good, you know, whatever the, you know, get Larry Copold on this or something. But we need to somehow communicate that there's real food and there's fake food, and we can steal a little meme from our dear president, and, you know, just start telling it like it is. That's fake food. That's poison food. That's not an apple. You think it's an apple, but that's fake news. This is a real
I
apple.
left out a part. I forgot about our negotiations with the school board and the food service system in Minneapolis. I forgot to tell you how I got them to agree to let us do a bid for organic apples.
Uh-huh.
Well, I threatened them right off the bat. I said, you remember the Alar scare back in 1986? I said, you remember how that became national news and that? I said, how'd you like to be on the national news? I said, because what we have done, we have 100 sample apples from the school district that we had our kids surreptitiously bring home. I mean, you're allowed to take the apples out of the lunchroom. And I said, and as we speak, I've sent those 100 apples off to a lab in Madison, Wisconsin to do a test. And we not only sent those 100 apples of the 60,000 apples you serve up every week, but we sent 100 organic apples too that were randomly selected from food cooperatives and natural food stores, because back then supermarkets weren't selling that many organic apples. There were a couple and they were, that got their attention, okay? And so we were dealing with a very eminent scientist, Warren Porter, in Madison, Wisconsin, teaches at the University of Wisconsin. And he had written a lot about the damage that pesticide levels that the government says are allowable do to young people, you know, and about how like the synergy between Roundup and nitrogen fertilizer and drinking water, you know, has this toxic synergy that's 500 times more poison. So Warren Porter was top of the line, and I got him to agree. And so he sent our apples into the lab that the state of Wisconsin typically uses for toxicology and pesticide residue testing. And so I hadn't heard back from him about a week after we shipped the apples. And I got him on the phone and he said, Ronnie, he said, I'm really sorry to say this. He said, the lab is refusing to do the testing. And I said, what? He said, yeah, they're refusing to do the testing. I said, why? Well, this was off the record, the guy told him. He said, our biggest clients, you know, will drop us, you know, which are big food companies and supermarket chains and the state of Wisconsin will drop us if we got into a controversy like this. So it's just like, and we looked around at other labs, but that is a situation too. It's not just the corruption of big ag and big food and, you know, politicians that look the other way. The scientific establishment is corrupted too. They don't want to talk about this. They don't want to talk about stuff that could, you know, cost them their money, cost them their jobs. So we got a big task ahead of us, but I really believe that I want to go back and do this again. Now that we have a lab, we helped a lab get established in Fairfield, Iowa, Health Resources Institute, that has the capability to do this kind of testing now, and they're not afraid. And so I'm going to, this reminded me, when I can go back to Minnesota, hopefully this summer, I'm going to collect those apples and I'm going to do it again. And this time we are going to put those people on the spot. And because I really do believe people are much more in tune now with the fact that, oh my God, healthy food for my kids and for myself is very important. And what was I doing eating out in restaurants all that time where I knew the food wasn't organic? I knew the meat and animal products were not grass-fed, but I was like, you know, I've been cooking at home, my wife and I and our 22-year-old son here at the ranch for the last, we haven't been to a restaurant, you know, in 5 weeks. And we are eating better. I mean, it's easy if you got your own organic farm, and we have an organic grocery store on the farm too. But I think people are getting into, they're going to get the taste again for home cooked food. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I just read yesterday in Food Navigator, organic produce sales are up 20% since the first of the year in the United States. Other than recommending the Rodale Regenerative Organic Certification label to consumers, what else do we recommend people do? One of the things we always try to tell people, they say, well, what is regenerative, you know, food? We just say, just make it simple. It's the next stage of organic. You know, it's the highest form of organic. And biodynamic, you know, up until now is pretty much a regenerative label. But most organic food in the US and around the world is not labeled as such. But if you can do a little research about this farm or this producer or this brand, I mean, it's usually not a regionally distributed brand, you can find out. And that's why it's so important that we keep farmers markets open. You know, believe it or not, some states are closing down farmers markets right now as we speak, but leaving Walmart and Kroger's and them open. So those states, we got to fight to keep our farmers markets open. Some states, believe it or not, are closing down natural food stores while leaving the Walmarts and the supermarkets open. And we need to know our farmers. We need to get to know our farmers. And you can do that. I'm sure we've all been to farmers markets, and you can tell immediately when you're talking to a producer, if you're at a farmer's market where you have to actually be the producer. Some of them are not like that, but you can tell by talking to someone. And especially if you ask, can I come visit your farm sometime, and their reaction and so on and so forth. We can do a lot more homework than we're doing now. Well, a lot of us are doing a lot of homework now since we're stuck at home all the time. But we need to continue this. The most important purchases that we make on a day-to-day basis is our food for our families and ourselves and our loved ones. And people are, you know, they're getting that. And when we come back out of this pandemic, we got to make darn sure that we have an increase in natural food stores, an increase in co-ops, an increase in community-supported agriculture, an increase in farm-to-table type relationships with restaurants. And that, you know, one of the best things about this pandemic is people have not been eating factory farm food in restaurants now, you know, for over a month, you know. And what we've got to realize is that we can keep this up, you know, and let's keep cooking more at home. You know, I've become a better cook. I've lost some weight. I feel better. You know, I've stopped smoking pot. The only pot I have is if it's an edible, you know, now, because I don't want any strain on my lungs. I have, you know, maybe I'll have a beer with dinner, but I'm not going to happy hour, you know, and having 2 or 3 with my friends now. And all these habits that we're starting to develop, I know some people are not able to eat healthy food while they're in social distancing, but I think we're going to come out of this on the other end with a higher consciousness on the part of consumers and better cooking skills, and our young people understanding more. But are we going to come out with better public policy? I mean, so far, all this rescue package coming out of Washington has ignored regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture, local producers, farmers markets. It's been.
So, Ronnie, I think this is the whole thing about Blessed Unrest. Is personally, I don't think the government's ever going to do anything much to lead. They may play catch up at some point, but the people in this right here, and the people who came today, and all the people who will be speaking, and the whole thing, that's where it all happens. That's where the
school district, your school district will listen to you, you know. Your local grocery store will listen to you. Your city council person will listen to you much more than at the federal level. And I just think we got to drive it on all 4 things: education, policy change, farmer innovation, and changing the way people have their money invested. You know, it's like we got $25 trillion in savings and retirement accounts, the people of the United States. Okay. It's like, where is that money? Is that being invested in regenerative food farming and land use? No. Well, that's our money, isn't it? I mean, that's our retirement. That's our savings, our banks. What's happening with our tax money? What's happening with the money in our bank? That's our money. That's not someone else's money. Well, the simple answer to all this is it's in the stock market, you know? And it's like, if we don't get that money out of the stock market, our money, and into regenerative, local, small business enterprises, it's going to take a lot longer to make the changes we need. And I think we can do that.
Well, I sure hope you're right about that. And I know that you have been fighting tenaciously on all of these fronts for decades. And I really appreciate the work that you've done and the kind of initiative you've taken with Regeneration International. And so here we are going onward. If people want to stay and continue the conversation, that's fine with me. It may not be fine with John because he has to be here till the bitter end. But
and I need to go too. I've been seeing phone calls from the farm coming in on there, and no telling what's happening, but it must be something of significance, so they wouldn't keep calling back. So.
Okay, well,
but
thank you.
I want to thank you, all of you, for what you're doing, and this showed me today you can do a conference using the internet, and it can be participatory and uplifting and informative. And we're going to be I've been doing one of these almost every day for the last month, and this is the best one though.
Oh, well, thank you.
So.
You know, flattery will get you everywhere.
Hey, Ronnie, how do we get in touch with you? May we email you some thoughts, questions?
Yes, just Ronnie at organicconsumers.org with 2 C's in the middle of the word. Organic.
I'm sorry, say that again. Ronnie at
organicconsumers.org. And if you go, and our website is organicconsumers.org or regenerationinternational.org, and you can see our regular writings and our information, and our newsletters are free.
Yeah, and it's a great website.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so everybody, look forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you know other people who might be interested, please send them this way. And I think we'll have another really interesting day.
Okay, adios, and keep up the good work.
Adios. Muchas gracias.